Starting a podcast is easy, but growing a podcast, now that is difficult. But one of the best ways to grow your new or existing podcast is by being a guest on another podcast in your same niche. But how do you become a guest on somebody else's podcast? You have to wait for them to ask you? Do you have to slide into their DMs? What's the best way? Well, luckily for you, today we have Ellen Yin here to share exactly how to pitch yourself to another podcast host so that you can become a guest on their podcast. One of the first keys to success in becoming a guest on other people's podcasts is making sure that you're reaching out to the right hosts of the right podcast. You really need to make sure that you are a good fit for this person and their audience. So let's hear from Ellen as she shares how to know which podcasts you should be pitching and which ones you should avoid.
Podcast guesting really allows you to expand your reach without having to wait months or years to build up your own audience first. So what I like to recommend is reverse engineer the process by searching on listennotes.com or owltail.com, which you'll see those on the screen. So make sure you save these two websites. So what you're going to want to do is when you get on these websites, I want you to search two things. First is I want you to make a short list of industry leaders in your niche, especially people who you know get a lot of publicity, who guest on a lot of podcasts already. Can you think of 3 to 5 names? So jot those down, and then I want you to search their names on these two websites, because what these two websites are going to show you in the search results are all of the podcasts that these people have guested on. So it's doing the homework for you, right? And now you can compile all of these podcasts that you know are reaching the right listeners because industry leaders in your own niche have guested on these shows. So that's one way that you want to compile a group of podcasts that you want to start reaching out to and pitching. The second thing you want to search are any keywords or topics related to your area of expertise.
All right, so now we know which podcasts we want to be pitching. We're pitching to the right people. That's important. So now let's hear from Ellen step by step on exactly how to pitch yourself for a guest spot on a podcast.
How do you actually structure your pitch? The easiest thing to do is to lead with generous action. Before you ever make an ask to be on someone else's show, you can show up and provide value to them first. Show that you care first. All you have to do is whatever show you want to be on, take the time to actually listen to an episode and then give them a 5-star rating. Take the time to leave a review. You don't have to make this a monologue, right? It can be simple 1 to 2 sentences. And then I want you to actually screenshot that review and attach it to your email pitch. I'm going to show you how to actually insert that into the structure of the pitch in our next slide. So keep in mind, each of these points should be 1 to 2 sentences max. We are not writing paragraphs here, right? You want to make it really easy for the host to read and skim your email. So again, you're going to open with a specific compliment on a recent episode to show that you have actually done your research, that you're leading with generous action. And this is where you would mention the attached 5-star review. Next, you're going to suggest a topic angle that they haven't covered on the show recently or maybe ever, and identify a tangible outcome that this discussion would provide their listeners with. So many pitches just include a bunch of talking points, but it doesn't really convey why this discussion or this interview or this topic of conversation is actually going to have a positive impact on the listeners. Speaking of talking points, here's a really cool thing that's also going to help set you apart from most pitches. I want you to include 3 juicy questions. These are suggested questions that you're giving the host to give them an example of the types of questions that you can answer during your interview on their show. And this is to help preview what your discussion could look like. As humans, our brains are wired to answer questions. We're primed to be curious, right? So when you write your talking points as questions instead, it makes the person who's reading that pitch either think the question in their brain as they're reading it, or even perhaps say it out loud. And now it's opened this door. It's like opening Pandora's box. And now they're intrigued. They're curious, right? They want to know, what is the answer to this question? And they're going to feel much more compelled and incentivized to want to bring you on their show to answer these questions for their listeners and, quite honestly, for themselves. To give you a tangible example of this, let's go back to that tip I had for the number one thing you can do to increase your response rates and booking rates for your pitches, right? So if I were to talk about that as a talking point in a pitch, then it would probably be something like the bullet point would be how to get booked on more podcast shows. That's okay, right? It's mediocre. Imagine if instead I wrote it as a question and I wrote this: what is the number one thing you need to include in your podcast pitch to guarantee a response from the host every time? Do you see how that completely changes what the energy of that pitch looks like and how curious you all of a sudden become about what that answer is? I hope that helps you when you're thinking through how you can phrase your 3 juicy questions. The more specific, the better. Now, to wrap up this pitch, you want to address what's in it for the host. Share your promotion plan for when your episode airs. The host is providing you a platform to get in front of their audience, right? So you want to be reciprocal. Again, always think about leading with generous action. So how can you also provide value to the host and bring new listeners to their podcast from your audience? Finally, end with a direct, clear question. For example, would you be interested in having me on your show? That leaves an open-ended, clear question that compels someone to actually want to respond. The worst thing you could do is end your pitch with some form of "let me know." Let me know if you're interested in having me on your show. Even though you're technically asking the same thing, again, a question translates completely differently than a close-ended statement. A statement doesn't invite a response, right? It kind of feels like a rain check. You're saying, hey, if you're interested sometime, let me know. But when you end with an open question, it makes people feel like there's an open loop that they have to close. It feels awkward or rude to ignore someone's direct question, right? It's much easier to leave a statement on red than it is to leave a direct question on red. You feel in some way that you at least need to respond yes or no, or whatever feedback you may have. So that's my other pro tip, not just for podcast pitches, honestly, but any sort of pitch you do, always try to end with a clear, open question. Now, I wanted to address the piece about your bio and your about me, because oftentimes I see that people lead with their bio or about me, when in reality, it should be at the very end of your pitch. So what I recommend is to link your bio or about me or your press page, wherever it lives on your website, in the PS section. This gives the hosts the chance to explore further and learn more about you and your credibility and the results that you've created for your clients and what makes you so awesome, without that taking up valuable real estate in the email. Because again, the email is not about you. The pitch is not about you. It's about how you can show up and create value for the host and for their listener. So you don't want to take the focus away from that in your pitch, which is why we give hosts the option to learn more about you at the very end of your pitch rather than leading with that information at the top. You can also link to a recent interview if you've been on another podcast and you want to showcase what you are like as a podcast guest in your email signature in general. So it doesn't just have to be in the PS section of this pitch to this specific host. You can also, in your general email signature, have some sort of little PS that's like, hey, by the way, catch this recent interview on so-and-so show where I talk about XYZ, right? And link it. And it's just kind of a subtle way to help spread the word that, hey, you are a great podcast guest and you are available to book more shows.
All right. Thank you, Ellen. Those were some awesome tips. Hopefully you feel more confident now pitching yourself to other people's podcasts. And I want to leave you with one tip of my own. By following Ellen's steps, you're going to make sure that you look like you know what you're doing, you know what you're talking about. And the worst thing that can happen is that they say no, right? They say no big deal. We move on to the next one. Life moves on. If you want to grow your podcast and you want to become a guest on other people's podcasts, you got to put yourself out there. You got to take a little bit of a risk. You can do it, but by following these steps, your success rate should be much higher. If you like this video and you want to see more just like it, make sure you subscribe to the HoneyBook YouTube channel. If you want to find out more about Ellen and check out her podcast, I'm going to leave all of her information in the description down below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.